And thank you to those who have joined us today. This is the final membership meeting prior to Election Day. And with that in mind, we've got a little bit longer program, but a training of what we do in case things do pop up that we need to react to either on Election Day or thereafter. As I've as I've said, saying yesterday, well, I hope it's over in a week, but I think many of us do. I've seen from polling the number of people that are just it's tired of all of it. But
Mhm.
our hope, obviously, is that we have a great turnout and that the election itself goes smoothly. But we want to prepare for all situations, and that's why we have today's program to go through several different scenarios. And David, you may want to introduce Nathan, who's been one of our guests for membership meetings prior.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. So I'm David Haynes, along with Scott, one of the co-leads for the Wisconsin Alliance for Civic Trust. For our regular members, you know us. For those who are joining, or who might be new to our group, we're a cross-partisan group supported by the Carter Center that is working to build trust in our political institutions. And kind of tap the brakes on some of the rhetoric and hot politics, let's say. So Nathan Stock, who's the Associate Director of the Conflict Resolution Program at Carter, is going to be co-leading the training today. Nathan?
Thanks. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, David. Great to be with all of you and to see some familiar faces. As David suggested, we're going to plan for rapid response to a range of scenarios that may unfold surrounding the election over the next few weeks and months. It's going to be an action-packed 2 hours. For those who haven't met me, I'm an associate director in conflict resolution with the Carter Center. But I'd like to pass it to my co-facilitator for this afternoon's program, Deborah Tien, to say a few words about herself.
Hi, everyone. Good to see y'all. I'm Deborah. I am the founding steward of an organization called Common Agency. We help people self-organize their neighborhoods to feel more like home. I'm one of Nathan's colleagues in a bigger collective called Hope PV, which is all about how do we harness our power to end political violence. So I'll hand it back over to you, Nathan.
Thanks. And I think, David, there were a couple special guests we were also going to have introduce what they're doing in this space.
Absolutely. So I think it's important to note for our network members that the work we're going to be doing today is work that other groups around our state have been working on now for a matter of months, even years. I think of the League of Women Voters and a number of other groups. In fact, there are more than 40 groups in a coalition that have just done great work around democracy defense and election protection, being ready for scenarios that might happen, building these relationships, communications, and so forth. And so we have two guests with us today that I wanted to just give a couple of minutes to talk briefly about what the coalition has been doing, and to remind everyone that we're not here today with our group to sort of reinvent the wheel. We want to augment the work that's already being done and hopefully just get more eyes on the ground. So we have Jamie Crofts from All Voting is Local and Peter Skopik from Secure Democracy. And if the two of you could maybe take like 3 minutes and just talk a little bit about the work that's already been done in our state. And thank you for the great work you've been doing.
Thank you, David. Thanks, Nathan. Thanks, everyone, for inviting us to join you all today. I think what we're doing fits really well into what the Carter Center and WisACT have been working on, what all of you have been doing across the state for several months too. So we're excited to be part of the conversation today. Jamie, could I maybe just pass it to you briefly to say what the Election Protection and Democracy Defense Coalitions are, and then I can talk a little bit about what we've been doing across the state.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks, Peter. Thanks, David and Scott and everyone else for having us today. Excited to be here with y'all. I'm the Senior Democracy Defense Manager in Wisconsin for All Voting is Local. And so I'm very plugged into the nonpartisan election protection work going on around the state. The League of Women Voters and many of our other amazing partners have observers who are going to be at the polls on election day. As well as we'll be working with the folks that run the 866, our vote election protection hotline, to make sure that all issues are dealt with and that everyone is able to vote. In addition, we have a democracy defense group here in Wisconsin that, in addition to worrying about the similar things as the election protection folks, also really digs in on things like preventing and responding to political violence, responding to mis and disinformation, and just making sure that all of the different organizations in this space are plugged into each other and have the resources that they need to really push this work forward. So we will be in communication before, during, and after Election Day. And we're also running a post-election canvas and certification monitoring program. And if anyone is interested in learning more about that, just message me, or I'll put my email in the chat for y'all. So thank you very much. Peter, did you have any, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I just want to say Jamie's been doing a really fantastic job at coordinating all of the many groups that are working on this across the state. So she's the perfect person to contact if you're interested in plugging into either the election protection work that's about, again, kind of defending voters and voters' ability to cast their ballots before the election and on election day, or the democracy defense work that's kind of more about protecting the system overall and making sure that a lawful election happens and that those results are respected, which we know is a big part of what the Carter Center and WisACT are doing as well. So again, really appreciate being here and excited to talk to you all about the different scenarios that you're planning for and how we can be helpful in responding to those. Thanks so much.
Thanks, guys. Well, it's great to have you with us. I'm really glad we're able to do some planning together. So with that, I want to kick us off. Can everybody see my screen? Okay, I see some thumbs up. Could I ask folks who are able to keep your video on? It's helpful for me and Deborah to get a sense of how much we're boring you. One quick note at the top. I guess I am recovering from some rebound COVID symptoms, and I'm losing my voice. So I'm going to try to power through this, but if at some point you can't hear me, wave your arms. We got a backup plan. So apologies in advance for that. But why are we here? Okay, folks, we are going to do 5 things in the course of the next 2 hours, and it's going to be great. First, we are going to help all of us better understand what political violence is and who in our country is being harmed by it. We will explore a couple of research-tested frameworks for nonviolently countering this phenomenon. We'll share best practices for communicating about political violence. We will look at specific scenarios that could arise in Wisconsin over the next few weeks and months. And so help me God, we will end this meeting with a plan for how we can work together to get ahead of a lot of this. With that, I want to pass it to Deborah.
Great, thanks, Nathan. So before we get going or continue moving, we want to take some time to get to know each other a little bit, because at the end of the day, what we're trying to build out is more of a plan of how we come together as a group to counter political violence. So I invite you to share in the chat your name and your location. And I also invite you to share a gift, strength, or superpower that you bring to this moment in your community in our country, and encourage you to try to describe it with one word or phrase. So I'll give y'all a couple minutes to type in the chat your name, location, and gift, strength, or superpower. Thanks, Alex. You're in Madison. You're very constructive. That's great. Mary, thank you for sharing your name. Would love to hear where you're based and a superpower. Anthony is based in Cable, good at collaboration. Eileen, hyper focus in Rock County. David in Milwaukee, listening. Jake, strategy, beautiful. Madison, maybe if you want to define it in the chat, Jake, because I know not everyone's familiar with that term. Mark is a crisis vet. Ooh, okay. Alan Oshkosh, professionalism. Jessica, pastor. Wow, y'all are all over the state, and also have a lot of different kind of skill sets to come together. And a lot of things I think come around kind of like helping people collaborate more in different ways, whether it's listening, whether it's focusing, whether it's the strategy piece, collaboration in general, or connecting people together. Like, this is awesome. This is awesome and a perfect group to come together for this task. So I did want to please continue to share in the chat if you haven't shared yet your introduction. And I wanted to also take a second to ground us a little bit, because some people in this Zoom space may have been directly impacted by political violence in your lives. And others of you might feel like you have little or no personal experience with political violence, but you're simply just concerned. And either side of the spectrum is welcome. And political violence is also maybe we'll talk a little bit about what political violence means in a second. But we do want to make sure that you take time to take care of yourselves, because talking about political violence can bring up traumatic experience. And so we have developed a draft set of group agreements for this session. And would love for you to take some time. We'll talk through these in a second, and we're very open to changing, adding, or taking away what feels like would be supportive for this couple hours together. So I'll just go through these pretty quickly. And I want if there's things that feel like it need to be changed, please say in the chat or come off mute and share out loud. So first off, please remember that members of this group may have very different politics and life experiences. I think you already know that. Speak from your own experience and community. Don't speak for others. Speak from what you know and not from what you've heard or read in the news. Recognize that these can be very traumatic topics, and that people of different identities are impacted differently by political violence. So it might not seem like it applies to you, but people who have different lived experiences, it potentially applies even more. This one's very important, is to give grace to each other. So like allow yourselves to, sometimes people will say things and it might not be the most smooth thing, and that's okay. That's okay. Let each other make mistakes and support each other through that process. Be present but not domineering. So I appreciate all of the participation already in the chat and everyone's camera coming on. So please, we're grateful for your presence, and we also ask that you allow others to share. So notice if you're speaking more than others. And finally, take what you can use, and leave what you can't. Not everything will be applicable to you personally at this moment, and that's okay. And we ask that you allow that to potentially be applicable for others, and just leave what you might not make sense for you. So yeah, I'm curious if this does this work for everyone? Are there any other questions about these agreements, and can we agree on these? I'm seeing some head nods in the video. I'm seeing some thumbs up. Give it a second. Thank you. I appreciate the participation. This is great. All right. So yeah, we've been using this term political violence for a little bit, and so we should probably define it. So what is political violence? Political violence, in the way that we're using it, is threatening to hurt or hurting another person or group of people for political reasons. Next slide. So it's important to notice that political violence has multiple forms and effects. It can take the form of direct physical violence, as well as the form of threats and intimidation. And so there's a lot of reasons to engage in political violence, according to people who perpetrate it, and they can include trying to achieve an unpopular political goal, asserting political power over another group, or communicating a political message. However, we also know there are many non-violent ways to deal with these issues. From, like, for the first one, instead of trying to use political violence, you could build community relationships. Instead of trying to assert political violence over another group, you could think about how to have power with instead of power over, and maybe think about using humor instead of violence to communicate a political message and things like that. So there's many potential solutions here that we hope people can explore more. We also want to make sure when we talk about political violence, note that, like, all of us are impacted by political violence, even if it's not directed at us. But there are some groups that are targeted more than others, such as Black folks, LGBTQI plus folks, women, immigrants and refugees, local election officials from all parties, and poll workers. So just to keep that in mind, that identity-based violence, political violence, and election violence are all interrelated. And this is the relationship we see. And also just want to give a shout out to Jessica. Thank you for sharing that you're momming. Thank you for doing that and taking care of the next generation. And yeah, if just as a note, if people need to step away, like we understand and we trust that you are taking what you can from this session in the kind of context that you're in. All right, Nathan, over to you to share a little bit more about political violence.
Yeah, thanks, Deborah, and thanks everybody for diving into this material. I know it's a little dense. I want to share a little data about how this phenomenon has been playing out in the United States over the last few years. The short answer is that since 2016, political violence in our country has definitely been rising, and there are a number of different data sources that make that point. This is a chart of threats made to members of the U.S. Congress as tracked by the U.S. Capitol Police, who are responsible for the safety of members of Congress. And you can see those threats peaking in 2021, dropping a little bit thereafter, but still being quite high. Another way to think about this, this is data from quarterly surveys of local elected officials around the country. These could be school board members, county government folks, assessing their degree of concern about being attacked on the job, being threatened, harassed, insulted, etc. And what you see, as recently as the second quarter of 2024, is those concerns remain very, very elevated, right? And this whole phenomenon, especially of threats to school board members, threats to zoning board people. I mean, this is really an entirely new phenomenon just in the last few years. In addition, national surveys make clear that there is a small but meaningful minority of Americans, including Republicans, Democrats, and independents, who are open to political violence, direct physical violence, and or engaging in threats to achieve political ends. Here are some of the numbers around that. Okay, that is all the bad news, and there's plenty of bad news. I don't want to sugarcoat that. But the first thing I want you guys to hold on to here is that the vast majority of Wisconsinites and all of our fellow Americans don't agree with that. This is from a survey commissioned by the Carter Center in June with a representative sample of Wisconsinites, and 81% say nothing could happen around the November election that would justify a violent response. That answer from folks in Wisconsin is very consistent with years of national data in which Republicans, Democrats, independents, they all say that political violence is never justified. So the first thing I want everybody to hold on to, because let's not kid ourselves, it's probably going to be a rocky few months here, is that most of us, folks on this call, most of the folks you run into in the grocery store, your friends and neighbors, regardless of other political differences, we agree on this critical thing. This is a majority position in our communities, in our states, in American politics. First key point I want to make. Second, the rise in particular in threats and harassment that we've seen since 2016 is a very bipartisan phenomenon. There's a fair amount of data on this as well. Those threats to members of Congress, I highlighted a moment ago, pretty evenly split between Republican members and Democratic members. Threats to local officials, similarly, local election workers. Both Republicans and Democrats are being victimized in this way. Now, to Deborah's point a moment ago about the relationship between political violence as a subset of identity-based violence, that is someone being harmed because of the color of their skin or their religion, that story is a little different. In the broad sweep of American history, it is certainly the case that persons of color, minority groups, marginalized communities are more likely to be harmed by direct physical violence. There's a long, ugly history of that. Think of the Ku Klux Klan, right? But but a lot of what is happening in our states over the last few years, the victims are quite bipartisan. Okay, so with that, I'm going to pass it back to Deborah.
Thanks, Nathan. So, yeah, this is a heavy topic, and as Nathan said, there's not luckily, like the vast majority of U.S. adults do not approve of political violence. However, I'm guessing some of us have seen political violence actually happen in our community. So we're wondering, you feel free to come off mute or share in the chat if you can share some stories about how you've seen political violence in your communities. Or even share some of the characteristics you're seeing or some behaviors you're seeing right now around you.
Can you hear me? This is Karen.
Yes. Hi, Karen.
Okay. Alrighty. Everybody around here knows that I am very active in the Democratic Party and long history. But the past couple of elections, when I put out signs, some of the two farmers, I'll tell you exactly. One is on Highway 14 between La Crosse and Viroqua, and the other one is 27 between Viroqua and Sparta. And both farmers, beautiful places to put out signs, and historically they have. The last election, both farmers had bullet holes in the signs. And one of the farmers said one of the bullets hit his tractor out by the barn. And he said,
Oh
I
gosh.
don't dare do this now for the safety of my family.
Oh
And both of them have said that. So this is real danger. This is real danger. And they chose not to put signs out right now. But this is horrifying. I just leave it at that. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Karen. That's really hard. I hope those farmers are able to. Yeah, I hope they're finding ways to feel safe.
But I guarantee they're going to vote.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm seeing some other folks kind of share in the chat. Alan talking about Oshkosh and nearby. There's been more kind of political signs being defaced and even vandalization of houses and cars with spray paint. Oh, I hope they're not saying things that are too violent. But Amanda talked about two canvassers she personally knows were threatened with gun violence and they didn't leave a person's property. Oh my gosh. And they were different communities too. Oh, yeah, I hope they are finding ways to kind of, to rest and recover from that. That sounds really hard. David talked about several stories of how in one case, a local political leader and his family was threatened and he was charged. Okay, that's good to hear, but it sounds really scary. And it's that kind of, it's the fear mongering that's the hard part about about political violence. Is it's meant to have it's meant, as mentioned before, like the people who are directly affected are directly affected, and then it's everyone around them that are impacted by holding that kind of fear in their minds. And a lot of times this political violence can even be amplified further. It can make people feel like everyone's should be scared because there's so many people who want to enact political violence, when, as mentioned before, in reality there's really a very small minority of people who even think political violence is okay, let alone the number of people who actually enact it. So there's a few kind of tactics that we've seen in the political violence playbook that we wanted to share a little bit with you, because we think understanding political violence will help us be able to combat it, or really set up an offense against it. So here are kind of like the 5 things we've seen that make political violence successful. And by successful, I mean it makes people even more scared after the fact of the political violence. So first off, cover up the injustice. So what people will do is they'll hide the unjust actions, deny they ever happened, to prevent word from spreading about them, which then makes the people who have experienced the political violence even indirectly feel like they're maybe going a bit crazy, and that's not ideal. The second thing that can happen is to devalue the target or victim. So they'll try to dehumanize the person who was targeted, make them try to lower the social standing of them so that people think it's, I don't know, more normalized to do this kind of act of violence to somebody. The third thing that will happen is to reinterpret what happened into their favor. They'll attempt to downplay the amount of damage caused by the injustice, portray the justice as unavoidable or for a greater good, and or deflect blame to others. The fourth thing is they'll try to hijack official channels to give a false sense of due process. They'll set up inquiries and investigations that move really slowly, limit political visibility or input, rely on technical rules, and provide only kind of the appearance of justice. And the fifth is they'll intimidate and bribe people to support their tactics. They'll threaten and reward people. They'll threaten people who may speak out against the injustice, and they'll reward people for remaining silent, which then again leads to more people feeling like feeling like they can't do anything to fight this process. Now, what we've also seen, this is kind of, again, we kind of start with the bad news here. And as you'll notice, the top of the slide is sort of like, how do we respond and make political violence backfire? So let's talk a little bit about what that means. So instead of covering up the injustice, what we can do is we can try to reveal the injustice, expose the challenge, and make it clear that this is actually an injustice. It actually happened. We have facts, and we have stories, and we have anecdotes, and we can share them. The second thing, instead of devaluing the target or victim, we redeem the target. We validate their existence, that we humanize them, we tell their stories, we make people feel like they're one of us, because they are one of us. We're all humans together. Third, instead of reinterpreting what happened in their favor, we try to reframe. So we interpret the event as an injustice. We don't allow them to say like, oh, this is, not a big deal. We say, actually, this is a really big deal. It is injustice. It is violent. It is something that we need to actually deal with directly. Instead of hijacking official channels, we redirect energy. We mobilize support to rely not only on official channels. We do keep the official channels there, and we also think about what are some more grassroots or kind of bottom-up efforts that we can organize in order to have more attention on the event that happened. And finally, instead of intimidating and bribing people, we build kind of resistance through building relationships together, so that we can actually resist intimidation and bribes, and people don't feel so alone in this process. So these are like what we call the 5 R's of making political violence backfire. And we're going to take a little bit of time to look into each one of them in a little bit more detail and share some examples. So I'm going to actually call on y'all to share some examples as well. So this is a framework. It's based on the work of an Australian academic who studied successful nonviolent protest movements in authoritarian countries, so all over the world. And we're trying to think about how can we apply some of the tactics that this person has learned to what's happening in the US right now. And so again, this is not necessarily meant to be this is not a de-escalation framework. This is more like the political violence has happened. Now, how do we make sure that that violence does not have that kind of amplification effect that we talked about, where fear is increased, but instead it's about how do we make that political violence backfire and have the opposite effect, where people actually think they disregard political violence even more as an action to take. So let's see. Let's start off with the first principle here, reveal. So again, in order for an injustice to backfire, it must be revealed. And this can happen through research and other types of evidence gathering, through interviews, etc., with people who have actually suffered that abuse. And it's important to make sure that that evidence is presented in a way that seems credible, is understandable, is a narrative that people will share. We can even call it mimetic, I guess, so that it actually gets distributed and people actually hear what is happening. So curious if y'all have any stories or examples of seeing political violence backfire in this reveal way. Maybe Nathan, if you can share an example,
Sure,
that might spur some ideas.
because
Yeah.
we have them ready to go for you. This is not a perfect example, but this is just a screen grab from a Washington Post story featuring a county government leader from Arizona, a guy named Bill Gates, some of you may have heard of, who did the right thing in 2020, voted per his obligations to certify Maricopa County's election results. And as a result, saw his life turned upside down. Inundated with death threats, his family had to move out of fear of their safety. I've met Bill in Phoenix. I don't know him well, but he sure seems like the kind of guy you would want as your next door neighbor. Wouldn't play the music too loud, would keep his lawn mowed. And in highlighting Bill's story, let me be clear. This is not a perfect example of citizens coming together from across the political spectrum to reveal what happened to a public servant who was trying to do his job in support of our democratic republic. This is the story in the Washington Post about the hell he went through that was published 2 years later. So let me be clear. This is why we are on this call. This is why we are on this call. We are going to make a plan today, right now, for how you can help us. We can work together in Wisconsin to respond much more quickly if we see cases like this, where civil servants, public servants, elected officials, candidates, whomever, are being targeted in this ways. So we can quickly organize people to say, whoa, wait a minute. This guy Bill is not some sort of weird deep state operative who's magically changing ballots. He's a civil servant and a corporate lawyer at a sporting goods store, right? Who attends church and has kids and, is a dad, right? That is why we are organizing. That is why we are having this call. So this is just one example of a case where I would argue reveal didn't happen in a timely fashion, or at least it didn't happen in the national media. But I think we can do better. And that's really the purpose of this conversation. But I'll pass it back to Deborah.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. So this is an interesting example because it also kind of ties in with the redeem side of things, right? We want to humanize Bill Gates with kind of like making sure we understand that he's just like one of us, and we want to make sure that people are not are treated as humans, and so providing more context and details, more personal details about the lives of people. Again, as Nathan said, he's a father, he's a neighbor, he's a etc. We want to elevate their positive values and actions, and we want to have others, especially those in roles that the audience trusts and respects, speak up on their behalf. And I think an interesting thing that Nathan mentioned around being prepared is around that article came out 2 years later, which is a long time. But if people are ready to go and actually trust each other, to be able to redeem people through kind of a revelation process, then that kind of media campaign can happen a lot faster. So I'm curious, actually, in your lives, again, like if you've seen, or what examples you've seen of people being redeemed and that leading to political violence actually backfiring because people are like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're actually doing this to like X group of people.
And that could be examples of this working well or not well, as was the case with poor Bill Gates in Maricopa.
May I enter? This is Karen again.
Yeah.
I was on the Vernon County Board of Directors and I was on the Emergency Management Committee. And we had somebody asked to be put on the agenda because they wanted us to impeach Janet Napolitano for naming some of the domestic groups, you know, the nativists, as domestic terrorists. And I'm the ultra liberal on the committee. And I saw that. I was truly not anxious. I was terrorized by it. Just that, oh my gosh. And I said to myself, do not say anything. Do not say anything. I didn't want to be a target. During the meeting, I think they filled up the visitors space and they were all wearing combat fatigues. Now, I took that as a personal threat and I didn't say anything. And we had some of the representatives sitting at the table and the rest were in chairs. And they were really angry because we were not going to initiate, getting rid of Janet Napolitano. And I looked across the table and there was a man in his fatigues. And I said, I see you served in Vietnam, because he had Vietnam patches and stuff. And he said, yeah, what of it? And I said, well, no matter which side of the political spectrum we sat, I just want you to know that I appreciate your service. Thank you for serving, because you left your family, your education, jobs, everything to serve, answer the call. And somebody in the audience said, she's all right. So it went from, thinking I was going to be the main target to being like, the angel of the day. So I think finding something common that you have may help diffuse it, as opposed to, shut up and go away, or, we're not going to respect you, or whatever. And, like I said, finding some common denominator that you can reach across that divide makes a big difference.
Yeah, I love that. Go ahead, Kathy.
Kathy Bernier, former state senator, former election official who spoke about the election of 2020 clearly and supporting our election officials because I was one. It didn't go over well with some Republicans, but I just want, I think the percentages are pretty clear, the percentages of people who, may be violent. I was not appreciated by a lot of Republicans, and in some cases still not. But for the most part, I would have Republicans come up to me and say, thank you for speaking and thank you for setting the record straight. We really can't say anything, so a lot of people out of peer pressure, I think mostly not out of fear, don't want to speak out. And I took some slings and arrows, but for the most part, I did not ever get any threats, mainly because I think people recognize that I was speaking from clear experience and knowledge and not just out of speculation. So I think it's important not to say things that you hear down the road, which you pointed out, Deborah. Don't repeat things you heard. Just speak from facts and your own personal knowledge, rather than repeating some things that you maybe saw on Facebook or X. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Kathy. Both of y'all, actually, I feel like there's a theme here of, like, this slide kind of makes it sound like you have to redeem other people, but actually sometimes it's about redeeming and humanizing yourself through actions like actually taking time to figure out what you have in common with other people from different perspectives, or from actually being courageous and saying, like, I can represent that group and I can share like very kind of like facts about the situation that other people then are able to actually connect, and I feel like relationship is where that humanization occurs in the most kind of pure way. So appreciate these examples that were shared. And Allison, I liked your example too, where it was amazing actually to see the Democratic Party, a lot of members of the Democratic Party condemning the assassination attempt on Trump, because it is a reminder that President Trump is also a human and should not be the target of political violence, just like the rest of us. So that's a great example. And Jake, your example is perhaps the example that Nathan wanted to talk about a bit more. Nathan, do you want to share, or should we invite Jake to kind of share a little bit Was
Yeah,
my
sure, Jake. Go ahead. I think you got the idea.
Oh, no, not at all. Please.
I
Go
mean,
to your slide here.
this again is not a perfect example because these two women were, you know, just election bureaucrats in Atlanta processing ballots in 2020, and some CCTV footage of them was spun up by the conspiracy theory types to assert that they had somehow committed some terrible fraud, when in fact there was no evidence for that. And again, their lives were turned upside down, and they went into hiding and faced death threats and so on. So this is not a perfect example of how these folks were redeemed, but it is an example of what I'm hoping we can do collectively and much more quickly should we see this kind of targeting occur over the next few weeks. But I'll pass back to Deborah. Maybe we'll move on.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. I'm seeing this question in the chat, Eileen. Actually, Eileen, do you want to come off chat and share a little bit more what's on your mind here?
Sure.
Oh, sorry, come off mute. Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is Eileen. I just was thinking through, the points on that slide, and I think, humanizing people really does make a huge difference. But I can also imagine, like, if you're somebody who is being targeted, that it could be uncomfortable or scary to share, personal details, like, especially if you're worried about, okay, now I talk about my family and then my family becomes a target of this as well. And just like, how do you respectfully and gracefully navigate those kinds of conversations or decisions?
Eileen, we're
Yeah,
going to talk about that a few slides from now. I mean, one of the core principles here is that we should not speak about impacted groups, individuals, or communities without talking to them first and engaging those kinds of questions. And we'll say more about that in just a moment.
Cool. So then our third principle here is our reframing. So ensuring that instead of trying to interpret the incidents as something that's okay, we actually need to make sure that they are reframed as the kind of level of injustice that they are. So that can include things like documenting the damage from the abuse to help kind of neutralize the perpetrator's narratives that, like, it's all okay, but it's like, no, if we show the facts around the damage that occurred, we can reframe again that this has been unjust. Communicate why it violates laws or why it held values, communicate who should be held accountable, and also remember that it might seem like it's an obvious injustice for some, but it's not obvious to all. And I think that's I think Allison's example comes in handy here, especially because we have to remember that that was just not okay. But there are definitely people who probably thought it was okay, but it is not. So I'm curious if folks have examples in this category about how we can reframe incidents as unjust. Oh, that's an interesting point, Alex. Do you have a example of this?
Let's see. Trying to think of a good one. And this happens all the time in with kids actually. I remember I remember being on that side. It was like, I do something disruptive because I want something, and then it's pointed out, oh, there was another way for me to get what I wanted. I could have asked this, I could have offered this. There's a whole negotiation process. And if people don't learn that, then the only tools that they have are the ones that disrupt things and harm people. So showing people their options, other options for addressing their underlying fears is, in my opinion, one of the most effective ways of addressing violence before or after the fact.
Wow, that's great, Alex, because it also shows people who might read about the incident or like hear about the incident, other things that they could do because we're all impacted by each other's examples. We are all kind of human modeling for each other, and some people might want to imitate what that happened. But if we share that actually you could try these 7 other things to get the same result, that's always helpful, because sometimes people don't have the space to be as creative, and because they're in different life situations. Amanda shared here as well. Campers were threatened, reported to the local police, who communicated. Yeah, so making and once the police kind of like label it as an unjust kind of crime, then that can be a way to reframe the whole incident as unjust. Nathan, would you like to share an example?
Sure. I mean, there's been an effort to whitewash what happened on January 6th, to repaint the perpetrators as tourists or patriots or what have you. This gentleman's story is interesting. His name's Michael Fanone. He was a DC Capitol police officer who was quite severely injured by the rioters on January 6th. And he's an effective messenger because he describes himself as having been, until January 6th, a very staunch supporter from President Trump. He was also severely injured by the rioters that day, and has since been on a campaign to try to ensure that the story is told correctly, the story of what happened there and then the injustice that was done. To me, that's a pretty good example. But I'll pass it back to Deborah just in the interest of time, and we'll keep it moving.
And so, last principle we'll talk about today is resisting. So how do we, again, resist threats and attempts to ward silence about the injustice and actually turn them into more callous or backfire? So to be alert to attempts of threatening, bribing, or intimidating, anticipating this intimidation and rewards, like documenting them, developing strategies to make them backfire, and being public about the fact that you're prepared for threats may be a good deterrent. Actually fits in well with the example we have for you. So actually, Nathan, can you jump into that example?
Yeah, I mean, this is probably a little beyond the scope of what we're going to organize over the next few weeks. A lot of the examples that we've talked about and we will talk about are premised around trying to respond quickly to problems, people who are being threatened or, violence at a polling location. But it's worth keeping in mind when you zoom out from the more narrow frame of election violence to broader political violence or broader identity-based violence, that there is sometimes a need for much wider and longer-term community responses. So this is an article about people in Whitefish, Montana, who organized a few years back when a prominent neo-Nazi set up shop in their town and wanted to make Whitefish a hub for his neo-Nazi anti-Semitic movement. And they organized nonviolently and essentially got him to move. They wouldn't seat him in restaurants, right? They made living there uncomfortable because the community was asserting that the hateful views this guy espoused were beyond the pale. And I think it's worth keeping some of that broader context in mind. I don't think that's stuff that is going to happen through this group over the next few weeks, but it is worth having some understanding of those sort of bigger picture cases. But in the interest of time, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about this phenomenon of political violence and the responses to it as a question of communications. This has sort of been threaded into our discussion up to this point, but there's a whole literature around mass violence and the language that is used before mass violence. Okay, we're at the anniversary, for example, of the Rwandan genocide. There was widespread public dehumanization in Rwanda in the weeks and months leading to the genocide, right? Calling people cockroaches, for example. The material I'm about to present is based on the work of a guy at Oxford, Jonathan Leader Maynard, who studied these common patterns of speech before violence and found that there are things that are said all the time. There are things that are said about the other guys, and there are things that are said about our team. This slide is an example of some of the language used about the bad guys, however we define them. Note that this is very general. They are coming to get us. They are an undifferentiated mass, and they're all bad. They're all criminals, right? We don't distinguish. They've harmed us. We have to make it right. And there's a common tendency to use really deliberately dehumanizing language. They're savages, swarms of people, right? These kind of patterns are very common. At the same time, there are some common trends in how the in-group talks about themselves, how we talk about us. One of the interesting patterns here is this idea that there are no other options for us. We have to use violence because, right? If we don't get them, they'll get us. A lot of that. There's also a lot of valorization of violence, a lot of, what some would call sort of toxic masculine language. Like, you've got to use violence. If you don't, you're a coward. It's the only way to protect your family. And interestingly, there's positive language that's used too. Well, if we just do this one ugly thing, we just get these people out of there, we'll have this better life. We'll have this utopia. Think of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia in the 70s, some of these really violent far left movements, right? They murdered half the people in their country, ostensibly in support of this peasants' worker paradise they were going to create, right? Okay, so first thing I would say here is I'm going to go on a limb and say that I have heard Americans use language like this over the last few years. I think we are already in a place where some folks in our country, at the extremes on both sides of the aisle, have been engaging in this kind of dehumanizing speech about their opponents. So let me state that first, but then I want to get into how do we respond to this? This is why we're here, right? We're going to make a response plan, and we're going to respond in ways that are effective and make it better, not worse. So before responding to threats of violence, dehumanizing language, and actual incident of violence, 3 things to keep in mind. Obviously, we're going to send you these slides, right? But this is a handy reference. Context, timeliness, and target audience. So the context first. What is the point behind the bad thing that is happening? Whether it's threats, whether it's, calling every Haitian in Ohio some kind of a dehumanizing term, why is this being done? And how widespread is it? Is it, just one guy in a dark corner of the internet and most people aren't picking up on it? Or is this a rumor that's spreading like wildfire? Is it designed to intimidate, right? If you hear language about armed, quote unquote, monitors at polling locations, is that being communicated to specifically intimidate people from not coming to vote, right? You got to think about that before we figure out what to say about it. Second, timeliness. Timeliness is not the same as fast. Timely is not the same as fast. The point here is we want to make sure that we are very careful to verify any information that we put out. This is the point that I think Kathy had made a moment ago about having your facts right. Speaking from your facts, you're absolutely right, Kathy. And take the time to get our facts right before we speak. And then finally, who are we talking to, right? Which communities do we need to reach? And do we have both the right messengers and the right communication channels? Some of you may have seen a presentation we did for WisACT a few months back, where we talked about the data we have on media consumption. And we saw in Wisconsin, as in other states, that low propensity voters are much less likely to read the newspaper. or watch local TV news. So, we have to keep in mind that, local media, traditional earned media may not be the best way to get key messages out, depending on who it is we're trying to reach. And of course, and this again is part of why we are together, we want to map out who are the best messengers, the best spokespeople that will have credibility engaging different audiences around the state, right? I'm not from Wisconsin. I'm just over the river in Minneapolis, but I lean left. I don't know, I would call myself center left these days. I'm probably not your best messenger for certain constituencies in Wisconsin or otherwise, right? So we got to think about that. All right. You've considered context. Then we've got these things we call the 3 A's. This is how you structure a response. 3 A's to consider when responding. Number 1, appeal to the broadest possible audience by underscoring shared identities and values. I'm going to guess there are a fair number of Packer fans on this call, right? Talk about that. You're in the land of Packers and cheese and beer, good beer, right? Talk that up, right? Talk about things that underscore that the vast majority of people in Wisconsin agree on certain things. You have these shared traditions and shared identity, right? Ground yourself in that. Even if it sounds a little corny in the moment, there's a lot of value in that because you're reframing the conversation away from the things that divide you, right? As you do that, affirm positive norms, affirm the behaviors that we want to see. Hey, in this state, we don't treat each other that way. We don't do that. Nobody does that. It's not acceptable. The frame can change. Maybe it's in Green Bay, right? In Milwaukee, wherever. But it is to assert that the bad thing that is being done is beyond the pale. It's not in polite society. You don't pick up the phone and harass some, poor retiree who's volunteering his or her time to work a polling place. Like, no, you're a jerk. Like, you shouldn't get the time of day if you do that, because no one in our community agrees with that, right? So you're setting positive values. We engage with each other with courtesy, grace, and respect, right? And then act. Always give people things they can do, right? If you just share the bad news, there's the risk that people can feel disempowered, which often is what the perpetrators want, right? The angry minority, and it's a pretty small minority in this country that has seized the microphone over the last few years and is ginning up all these threats and fear, whether they know it or not. I mean, I think what they want is to chill the rest of us from engaging. And one way to counter that is to show people, number one, the vast majority of us want to see better behavior. The vast majority of us reject threats and violence and intimidation. Oh, and by the way, here's what you can go and do, right? And that message, that call to action is going to evolve. It's going to evolve over the next few weeks. Right now, presumably, the call to action is go and vote, right? Go vote, go exercise your democratic franchise. It may be, join us in pushing out this messaging on social media where we remind folks that accurate election results take time, and we're all going to have to be patient Americans while we wait for final results to be called, right? Maybe it will be, hey, please join us in signing on to this letter to the editor where we call on officials in County X to certify their election results, right? There's lots of things we'll be able to do, but it is important to give folks something concrete that we're asking them to do. And then a few additional considerations, and this goes to a point that was raised in the chat: center and support targeted communities. So we've seen a lot of rhetoric, most of it, I think, just not based in the facts, raising concerns about non-citizen voting. If that picks up, and then you see, which is possible, right, threats to people who might or might not be non-citizens but are perceived as such. If this group is going to talk about that, don't do that until you've called somebody in that community and talked to them first, because you don't know what they're experiencing, right? Like, whoever the vulnerable group is, maybe it's election workers who are being threatened, but we've got to have connections into those communities so that we can hear from them what they need and what they're comfortable with before we go out and speak on anyone's behalf. Be really careful in how we talk about violence and how we talk about misinformation. You still see the media making this mistake. I get real annoyed when I read an article that says violence erupted at a protest, like it's a volcano. People are not volcanoes, right? If there's an act of violence at a protest, be very, very, very specific. There was a peaceful vigil in support of our election workers. 2 people engaged in property destruction. Protest organizers asked them to leave, and they were subsequently arrested by law enforcement. That's very clear. That doesn't unnecessarily sow fear or give in to some sort of specious narrative of chaos, right? Similar with misinformation. Always, where you can, avoid repeating misinformation because it tends to make it stickier. If you have to talk about it, make sure it is sandwiched between 2 facts. We talked about building and asserting positive norms and identities, and always being sure to create a sense of agency and action. Last thing I want to say here, it's just that there's some kind of obvious things not to do, which you've probably already picked up on. But don't speculate. Don't conflate individuals and groups. Don't be alarmist. Don't be vague. Don't be defeatist. Don't talk about violence without condemning it and highlighting responses. Don't raise the profile and notoriety of violent actors. Let me pause there. I know that's a lot. Again, we're going to share these slides. You'll be able to access a recording of this. But any reactions to or questions about this material? Yeah, I see in the chat, when you're feeling afraid, don't spread it. Yeah.
Nathan, my question was about what to do when the media reporting is the problem. Like, do you have strategies for working with the media to help them avoid amplifying or sensationalizing and creating the problem themselves?
Yeah, some of that work is being done, not necessarily directly by us, but the group that I cite on these slides, Over Zero, is doing training for journalists on these exact things. The Carter Center actually just signed off on a guide that's been developed for members of the media that gets into a lot of these points. We put our logo on it too, just to try to amplify it more. So some of that work is being done. I think as citizens or consumers of media, if you subscribe to a local paper or what have you, I think it's also appropriate to reach out if you see these things happening. Call the paper and just raise those concerns. But I can say that there's definitely an effort to work on these issues with media. Eileen.
Not a question, but 2 comments. I think that the way this is laid out is really, really helpful and valuable. So I know I've gotten some takeaways already, and we're just halfway through the time together. So thank you for that. And then the other thing is, I know that you're planning on sharing the slides. I do imagine if I go back to the slides, there might be some times where I'm like trying to figure out, like, okay, was this something when they were talking about it? Was this what the quote unquote bad actors are doing? And like, this is what people trying to prevent political violence are trying to do. And just like, if there could be like some sort of like a label at the top that indicated that would personally be helpful for me to navigate it.
Okay, yeah, I'll see what we can do. Mark.
I would just say kind of I really like the point about if you have to talk about violence, sandwiching it. In the same way, reality is nuance. And I think my experience with the media over the years has kind of been that nuance is not necessarily the easiest thing for them to pick up or present within an edited story. And I don't know if the issue happens at the editing level or if the issue happens at the reporting level. But I think that example you gave, Nathan, about being specific about here's the number of people who did X, here's the number of people involved in X, whether we're talking about, say we've got 2 people in Dane County who are non-citizens who voted. talking about it in that specific way where we're being fact-based and contextualizing the problem gives us more credibility and also helps the public understand the scope of the problem, and then they can judge for themselves, the relative merits of the issues. And I think that's critical. I don't know that it really fits real well to what you're talking about, sorry, but I think it kind of dovetails. I just thought I'd mention that just because I've kind of been down that road.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, context is key. And I know it's hard. It's hard to get media to cover this stuff. They have their own space and time constraints, right? But that's what we're going for. Context and specificity wherever possible. Okay, so we're gonna shift gears a little bit and get into more of our planning. This is where we're gonna peer pressure all of you to sign up and help us with all this. The first thing we're gonna do here, bear with me, this is not gonna be as painful as it sounds. There are a couple of QR codes on these slides. Can I get a show of hands if you have the app WisACT on your smartphones already? It is the world's most common messaging app. It is a Facebook product. I see some hands going up. Okay. Yeah, that's great. All right. So obviously you don't have to do this, but here's what we're asking of you if you're comfortable with it. If you don't have WisACT, you can click on one of these two codes. It will take you to the App Store and you can download the app. If you have an Android phone, you got to click on the green boxed code to get to your App Store. You download the app. Then once you have the app, you click on the green one again, and you will be magically whisked into a closed communication group for people on this call. If you have an iPhone, you got to click on the code to the right. That one, if you don't have the app, that'll take you to the App Store. You get the app, then click on the green one to the left, and again, you get magically brought into the same group. Okay, the idea here is we need a fast and secure way to talk to each other over the next few weeks and months. This is a moderated group. It is not open to the public, right? This is just for us to talk to each other. And as we'll talk more about in just a minute, the purpose is so that, should we hear information, should any of you hear information about threats, violence, harassment, pick a thing, right? This is a place to talk to each other about it.